In this here modern world of ours, we take a lot of things for granted. We seldom give thought to the ease with which we can get our hands on goods produced in other countries when, for a time, the only international goods were luxury goods. Spice used to be all the craze in Europe, but a few other goods would find their way to the continent over the centuries. One such good was tulips. Specifically, tulip bulbs. As it turns out, people deriving their sense of self-worth from the stuff they own is a timeless phenomenon. For tulips were prized possessions amongst European aristocrats with long names who sought desperately to distinguish themselves from the peasantry. So it was that the acquisition of tulips was exclusively a rich man's game. But in time, the middle class and even the working man soon thought themselves to be pre-Wall Street tycoons. Everybody in Holland wanted tulips, and as we all know, when demand outstrips supply, prices fly sky fucking high. It didn't take long for people to begin speculating on the value of tulip bulbs, which only served to further drive prices higher. There eventually came a point when a single tulip bulb could trade for as much as 6 times the annual salary of the average Dutch citizen. Of course, rampant speculation begets bubbles, and bubbles beget bursts. And so the tulip market would eventually collapse in 1637. You may be wondering what one does with a tulip bulb. I mean, for a good to trade for so much money, it must have had some kind of unique and fantastic utility, right? Allow me to explain what one does with a tulip bulb. You put one in some dirt, and then it'll turn into a flower. I mean, at least the tulips were tangible. Good more after Eve night, Cosmoronic number 6, I'm fringing, I hope you're doing well. Man, Elden Ring, that seems to be all the craze right now, huh? I actually finally grabbed a copy last night. I've been hearing too many good things, and, even despite my relative unfamiliarity with the Soulsborne series, I did have a lot of fun with Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3. And Sekiro was pretty cool as well. Though it does seem like Elden Ring has received the most glowing initial reception of them all. In fact, I'm pretty sure that the Metacritic score for that game is 97. That is very high. That is very, very, very high. There are not many games that receive... Like, for reference, I'm pretty sure that there are only 3 or 4 other games that have ever received such a high number. Now, of course, number scores don't really tell you anything, right? But I guess when you look at the general reception the game has amongst players, seems to be indicative of something. That the game be really cool. You can obviously see the DNA of like Demon Souls and Dark Souls and pretty much all of the games that they've made since that point. But this one has got more of an open world design as I understand it. I hear that there's a lot of comparisons being made to Breath of the Wild, which is interesting. Apparently there are 619,000 people currently playing the game on Steam, which would make it the highest... That would make it the most played game on Steam right now. It's so interesting to think about how important From Software's Souls series and the adjacent titles have become. What could have easily remained a niche series has become a huge cultural phenomenon. And, I do love to see it. Like, it's cool that a single-player RPG that's difficult with lots of depth, that these types of games are finding mainstream appeal. Kind of feel a little bit bad for Horizon Forbidden West, though. That came out a week ago, and it feels like Elden Ring has completely overshadowed that game. There are so many games that I need to play. Disco Elysium, I started, put an hour into it, though I do wonder now how much time I'm gonna put into it over the next few weeks since I bought Elden Ring. I still need to play Soma. I'll play it eventually, I will, I swear. I need to play God of War now that it's on PC. I remember... That seems to be a more common habit for me in recent years when I buy games for PlayStation 4, play them for a couple hours, and then nothing would come of it. But now that it's on PC... there's much more of a reason to play it. I would love to play that game at a higher frame rate with more smooth gameplay. And that's another one that I hear nothing but good things. Seems like a game that I would like, but I'll get around to it eventually, maybe when it's on sale. I'm looking forward to playing Elden Ring, though. As for when I'll play it, and whether it'll be on stream, well, we'll have to wait and see. You know, following Elden Ring's release, as expected, the topic of difficulty in video games has once again dominated the general gaming discourse. It's a meme for a reason. And yeah, clearly this game is no exception to causing that discussion to arise. So, let's talk about difficulty in video games. I find the subject of difficulty in video games to be a broader topic than it's often made out to be. It always feels like it's approached in a very simplistic way when really there are no simplistic answers to the role that difficulty plays in video games. And I feel like to really get anywhere with the topic, you have to like dive deeper and think about what video games are fundamentally. Like, we need to start from a base so that once we figure out sort of like a core understanding of what video games are, we can start to build up from there when we think about what role difficulty plays. What does that mean? I feel like that means we need to start with addressing pretty much the obvious, but I think it's still important to talk about. Video games are interactive experiences. More importantly, they are necessarily interactive experiences. That is the defining trait of video games. In much the same way that the defining trait of a book is that it's written in words printed on a page or on a screen. A film is roughly 1 to 4 hours. Visual and audible. A television show is serialized, split up into parts. Video games are necessarily interactive and they cannot be passively engaged with, which makes them different from every other medium of entertainment. Books are kind of interesting in that they can't be passively completed, but exist as complete works regardless of the reader. Like, the reader has no input on the completion of that story. But a video game, well, someone has to play it. Somebody has to pick up the controller, put their hands on the keyboard, and engage with the mechanics, and explore the environments, and progress by completing challenges. I think I'm focusing too specifically right now on, I guess, what we would generally think about as video games, like when you're a person who plays games on PC or console, you know, games with a player character that have a story. But I mean, this applies to all games, which includes the games that don't even have protagonists, like puzzle games or strategy games. There are a set of challenges before the player, and the player must engage with those challenges in order to win, essentially. But in order to win, you have to be able to lose. At least that's something that we could say generally. I'm not sure if I fully agree with the sentiment that fail states are a universal component of video games, but I mean, they are a near universal component at least. And if they are a near universal component of video games, then any game may be impossible to complete for some number of people. Is this unavoidable? That a game's being interactive necessarily means that some people won't be able to complete it. If I turn on a film, or turn on my TV to watch a TV show, I can walk away, and the TV show will complete itself. It will play from beginning to end. Now, I will have gotten nothing from it, because I didn't engage, I didn't watch it, but I don't need to do anything for it to play out. The film, the TV show, will complete itself, regardless of my input. Video games can't do that, which means that there will potentially, depending on who I am, I may just be incapable of completing it. And this has nothing to do with, like, disabilities or anything like that, because, I mean, we've seen examples, plenty of examples of how disabled gamers have managed to play and complete very difficult games. This is not really a question of, sort of physical capacity. It's kind of half and half. It's like twofold. It's, are you able to understand what the game wants you to do, and execute on it. There may always be some people, depending on the difficulty of the game or the kinds of challenges that it's asking you to complete, whether they be, you know, simple matters of dexterity or more mental components like in a strategy game, there will always necessarily, in theory, be people who will never be able to complete a game. Now, this makes the topic of accessibility interesting, because accessibility tends to be a conversation which is tethered to the discussion of difficulty in video games. It seems to, like, it really feels like difficulty in video games as a discussion has arisen more so in the last few years due to broader cultural issues in the world. Like the idea of, well, if a game is too difficult, then it's not going to be accessible to people. There should always be options to enable people to play video games that they find too hard. The conversation always is always oriented around utility, specifically how much utility can anybody extract from any given game. Something that I feel is ignored in that discussion, though, is that challenge is a unique aspect of video games compared to other mediums of entertainment. It is a component of video games exclusively. You could say that other forms of storytelling and entertainment have challenges, in a sense. Like, for instance, like the Teletubbies is not going to be as cerebral as, like, Mr. Robot. And, you know, a children's book is going to be more easily consumed than a book with incredibly dense prose. There are degrees to all forms of storytelling and entertainment. You know, a challenge, I guess. When you think about video games, the challenges are, here is an obstacle, figure out a way around it. Here is a platform, jump over it. Here is a puzzle, figure it out. These are the obstacles before you that you need to complete before you proceed. I feel like we often don't think about this idea. What are the artistic merits of difficulty in video games? Say you're a developer who decides to make a game. Let's say you're making an RPG. And you are gonna have the player control a character who is on a quest in a very dangerous realm. And we're gonna tell a story about how this particular adventurer's morale is steadily diminishing with all of these challenges that he has to confront that are really difficult. And let's contextualize in universe that when he dies and respawns, that is something that's happening in the world, but it's having an effect on him mentally. In kind of in the same way that when you encounter a challenge that you just cannot surmount and you have to keep trying it again, that it starts to have an effect on you. And we're going to tell a story about that. We're going to tell a story that is intrinsically tied to the challenges that this character has to surmount, and the effect that it's having on them. And I want to make the game difficult to further fuel that story. Is that not just a valid choice, artistically? And furthermore, is it not also valid, artistically, to have only one difficulty setting? Because I want every player to grapple with this specific challenge, and I fully expect that some people won't be able to finish it, and that is my choice as the developer. Could it be said that the decision to create a difficult game, one which may well be inaccessible to many people, is simply a legitimate artistic choice which ought to be respected? It feels so often that when we have the discussion of difficulty in video games, the proponents of, well, no, there should be difficulty settings. No, not all games should be ball-busting hard. That's not fair. That's stupid. Just ignore that challenge is a component of video games in general that contributes to the value of the art form. A lot of people play video games because they like to be challenged. You know, that's what they're in it for. Like, there are some people who want to play the, you know, give me a story mode where the challenge is basically non-existent and you're there for the, just for the narrative. But of course, there are other people who are looking for a challenge. We ignore that the developer just may well be like, no, I want the game to be this difficult, and that's the end of it. As we see with the Soulsborne series, there is one difficulty setting, essentially. It's often said that, well, I mean, there's no problem with difficulty settings, right? Like, all games should have difficulty settings. That doesn't compromise the experience for other people. You can have a hard game if you want, but make sure that there's a difficulty settings available for people who want an easier experience. That's easy. That's not an unreasonable demand, right? Difficulty options in video games are more complicated than one might first think, and I feel like these incredibly reductive ideas on just add an easier difficulty setting, what's so hard about that, ignores a lot of important discussions that need to be had about game design. I feel like it's just too simple to say, throw in difficulty settings without any regard for the consequences they may have on the rest of the game and the experience for other people. I mean, first of all, some games more easily support difficulty options than others. How does one add difficulty options to a platformer? Like, how do you make the platforming challenges easier other than to render them a non-challenge altogether? I talked about this in my Crash video, which I would recommend you watch if you haven't. But I mean, there's only so much that can be done to make a platforming challenge easier for you. At some point, you simply need to have the dexterity to clear the jumps. And if you can't, there's not really much that can be done for you. Even if you were given invulnerability, there may simply be jumps that you're not capable of doing because you can't, like, slide jump in Crash or something. You're just not able to do it. So what can they do for you at that point? You know, the same thing goes for puzzles or strategy games. I suppose they could give you hints, but if the hints reach the point that they're just telling you how to complete the puzzle, kind of removes the challenge completely. Like, what are you there for? If there are components of a game that you can include that simply make it easier to complete the challenges to the point that the challenge is removed, you know, like, what are we here for? What are we looking to get out of video games as an experience? Another thought as well, I'm thinking about, you know, including difficulty settings in video games. Some games more easily support them than others, but also, you know, what form do we want difficulty options to come in? First of all, we need to sit down and think about what it means for a game to be more difficult or easier in a way that is broadly applicable to the majority of players. Is it more difficult simply that you have less health and the enemies deal more damage? Or is it more difficult that the enemies are more intelligent and they force you to play differently? Is it more difficult if we give you a harsher time limit to complete a challenge? And in recognizing all of these as options, which one should we go with? They're not all necessarily going to be suitable for the game that we're making. Sometimes it can be really annoying when the challenge is simply, oh, you have less health and the enemies deal more damage. That can feel cheap. That can compromise the balance. This is an important part of the discussion. Do difficulty settings compromise balance and create flaws in the design which otherwise wouldn't exist? Now, Halo is often said to be balanced for heroic, which is the second hardest difficulty in the game. Below legendary and above normal. Is there not an implication with that statement that one should expect a less balanced experience on any other difficulty? Would it be said to be subpar? Well, not necessarily. I guess it depends on the result. But I mean, you think about Halo 2, where you've got the sniper jackals that kill you in one hit. That, like, Halo 2 is a notoriously frustrating and unfair experience on Legendary. You know, because it's just too easy. No, not too easy. It's the opposite of that. It's too hard. It's too hard to beat as a regular player. Now, that's an example in the direction of hard, of a compromise in the game's design because of the changes that have been made to difficulty, or to accommodate difficulty. Like, surely it can go in the other direction, right? Where if you add an easier mode, a lot of the systems in place that were balanced for a certain difficulty begin to break down. You know, the balance and the core gameplay loop is tailored for a specific experience, and to simply make it easier, or I guess conversely, to simply make it harder, almost arbitrarily, just leads to flaws being exposed. I would say that when reviewing a video game, like if you're trying to do a full critique of a video game, it is worthwhile to play a game on multiple difficulties, because when you do, the flaws of a game's design may become more apparent. Like when you play a game at the highest level of play, but also conversely, when you play it at the lowest level of play, you can start to see through the system. Sometimes, to be clear. Like, it's not a universal problem. Some games have really well-balanced and well-thought-out difficulty levels, or difficulty options, but sometimes they don't. And when that happens, you can start to see the cracks appear. And if that is the consequence, like that a game would be rendered devoid of challenges or incredibly unfair, depending on the difficulty settings, would it be better for the unbalanced difficulty mode simply to not exist? Now, you know, one might retort, well, I mean, that's the developer's job, is to figure out these things, to actually balance the difficulty settings. But I mean, there's got to be a question of resources there. If I can not have multiple difficulty settings, and I can focus heavily on the one and only mode of play, that's going to yield better overall results. Opportunity cost. We never talk about opportunity cost. Well, I mean, we talk about it all the time here. We never talk about opportunity cost, and we should. It's important. It's important. I'm telling you, it's really important to think about. I had this thought the other day. The thought finally began to coalesce in my head, and it's relevant to this topic. What if you have a game where the difficulty, there is only one clearly defined difficulty, but through engaging with the game in certain ways, you can make it easier for yourself by grinding, by looking for really helpful items, you know, by slowing down and exploring more thoroughly. I'm not sure what I would call this. I think the best term I can think of to describe it would be emergent difficulty. The difficulty is, to some extent, the consequence of the player, and the player can make it easier or harder for themselves. But the game is designed with this in mind. The game knows that you can farm and has places for you to farm. The game knows that some people might go off the beaten track, and it rewards those people by making the game a little bit less of a challenge. I mean, that's what the Souls games do. If we talk about adding difficulty settings, does this throw a wrench into, this as an option? Alternatively, is this not part of the discussion when we talk about difficulty in games? Instead of adding an easier mode, and this is not strictly get good, it's more get involved, get engaged in the game, explore it thoroughly, give it a chance. How does difficulty influence design when a developer is keeping in mind that novice players are going to be engaging with it, and they make changes to the core design in order to ensure that those people are better accommodated, but not in a way that keeps the skill ceiling super high, but instead in a way that reduces the skill floor and the skill ceiling? How do we think about this, especially with regard to a multiplayer game? You know, one of the big issues with a lot of recent FPS, by recent I mean a trend that's kind of been happening for the last decade, has been the deliberate reduction of the skill ceiling through the introduction of random elements, or otherwise just making it harder to stay alive for longer. I remember this was a big problem with Call of Duty for a while. I don't know if it's still a problem now. Last one I played was Modern Warfare, and the one before that was Black Ops 3, so not super familiar with Call of Duty lately, but I remember that for a time, something that was particularly frustrating about those games is it felt like there were so many ways by which the developers were really trying to make it harder for you to play consistently well, because the level design would get so convoluted and the movement system would get so crazy that you could basically be shot from anywhere. and there was very little you could do to account for it because the time to kill was so low. If someone sees you first, that's basically the end for you. In Call of Duty anyway. You know, the introduction of random elements makes it harder for skill to shine through. Makes it an easier and more rewarding experience for newer players, but it really damages the experience for older players. The simplifying of design in order to accommodate players who aren't as good at the game can pretty obviously lead to negative consequences for the experience of more veteran players. What do you do if you're playing a Metroidvania and you just can't figure out where you need to go? Of course, you could have hints, but again, should the hints just tell you exactly where you need to go? Or should the level design be simplified in such a way that nobody is ever going to get lost? Like, it's just impossible for anybody to get lost. Not impossible, because it can never be impossible, but so ridiculously evident where you need to go, not through particularly great design, that nobody can miss it. I am not opposed to difficulty settings as a principle. I am not opposed to finding ways to make games easier for people to engage with. I mean, of course, I would like it for more people to play video games, because I think video games are real swell, and the more people play them, the more games it'll come out. And it's a good old time. But it's more complicated than just, yeah, put in new, easier difficulty settings. Just do it. It's more complicated than that. It has to be. Game design is complicated. You know, you have to be really deliberate when thinking about the decisions that you need to make in crafting a game. Because one change here can lead to substantial ripple effects elsewhere. No single choice is quite as simple as it seems. And, of course, there's an element of the discussion that we haven't touched on that is somewhat relevant, which is there not legitimacy to the argument of get good? Is there no legitimacy to the argument of get good? Really, you know? Maybe the problem is you. Maybe you need to give the game more of a chance. Maybe you need to slow down and really engage with the mechanics. You know, maybe the game just isn't for you. Feels like we can't. That's not an acceptable answer to some people. That the game just isn't for you. That you might find a more rewarding experience elsewhere. That this game is specifically made to be hard, and a shared hard experience on a one difficulty setting. This is something we didn't touch on, which I would like to. The meta. How does the meta contribute to whether or not a game should have difficulty settings? When you complete a game, like a Souls game, everybody had to beat it on the same difficulty. The challenge was universal for everybody. Nobody beat it on an easier difficulty where they had more health and the enemies dealt less damage. Everybody had to surmount the same challenges in order to win. And so, when you talk about the game and the challenges you encountered and how great the bosses are, you all have a common understanding of the game because you all had a common experience. Of course, your experience varies depending on the choices you made and how good you are at the game, how much you understand about the mechanics, how much you leveled up your character, the items that you had. But I mean, ultimately, you know, it was a level playing field for all of you. All of you were equally positioned to win. Is there not something really valuable about that? And something that would be lost if you had other difficulty settings? Now it just brings us all the way back to, yeah, maybe it's not for you. There are plenty of games out there that have difficulty settings. There are plenty of games that are accessible, that aren't too challenging. These all exist. There are so many games. There are so many games to play. But it feels like sometimes there's this fixation on, well, no, this specific game that I frankly have no interest in ought to be made easier, or at least facilitate other players, regardless of the artistic merits of challenge, or the wishes of the developers, or the fact that the game is fully designed for this one specific difficulty, or that this game has a meta that orients around its universally hard difficulty, that it ought to be changed to accommodate me specifically. The word entitled gets thrown around a lot when it comes to video games. I try to avoid it as best I can because what does it mean for you to be entitled in terms of a product that you bought? But I don't know, man. I guess to be clear, before we wrap up on this topic, difficulty settings are not, all the same. There are some games that have pretty piss poor difficulty settings, and there are some games that have excellent difficulty settings that are really balanced. Smarter enemies, not necessarily just more enemies, but perhaps different enemy placements, different enemy types instead. Challenges elsewhere that otherwise don't exist in the other modes. Maybe you could have something like no HUD that can be really cool. Like the Metroid games where they have no HUD, and when you reload, I think you lose all of the bullets in the magazine if you haven't used them all. You got a lot of options for making difficulty settings really cool. And really being able to accommodate a vast array of people. But I guess it's just worth remembering that some games aren't going to go for that, and I think that's fine. That they are focused on creating one specific experience, and that experience is hard, and that some people aren't going to be able to complete it, and some people aren't going to enjoy it, but some people are really going to value it. I don't know, it feels like a discussion that's never going to truly end, especially for so long as we all have different ideas of what games ought to be, because depending on what you think games ought to be as an experience is probably going to influence your perspective on this topic. You know, because there are some people who don't really think about video games through the lens of challenge at all. It's like an experience that they're aware has challenges in it, but it's not much thought is given to it. But for other people, that is the core of the experience, the challenge, the difficulty, the test. And overcoming those tests, and just how satisfying it can be when you were confronted with a very difficult boss or a very difficult section, and you just managed to surmount it. You finally beat it. The catharsis, wonderful. It's a big old topic for which there will be no resolution soon, I imagine. I'm thinking about storytelling tropes. Not specifically tropes themselves, but how an awareness of them can influence the perceptions people have about stories. I think about conversations I've had, videos I've watched, where tropes come up and sometimes feel like they derail the discussion. I've talked about it plenty of times before, but I guess to make it clear before we proceed, when I think about my approach to figuring out what works and doesn't work in stories, or, you know, what makes them good or bad, what I try to work from is some sort of consistent standards that can be as best as possible, universally applicable. Consistency is at the heart of it, like that cause and effect is functioning as it ought to. That's like the root of it, and then we can extrapolate from there about choices you make in terms of like characters or world building. But that's the start, is consistency. I try not to think about as much the meta of like storytelling analysis, writing analysis, and when I say the meta, I mean sort of observations about tropes and cliches and trends in storytelling, the trappings of genre and what you ought to do for a story about genre in a certain genre based on what other people are doing. I just find that those can lead us astray and potentially rob us, or, you know, in the case of if you're writing something, rob yourself of what could be a really great story. I just try not to think about it like that. I like to focus on, well, let's take it, you know, one story at a time. Who is this character? What are their traits? Are they making decisions in line with their traits? Is this circumstance following? Is it following cause and effect? Is it challenging the character in a way that may lead to growth or may not lead to growth? You know, just more fundamental, I guess, than thinking about tropes. But it feels like sometimes tropes kind of dominate how certain people view stories and think about stories and analyze them, and influences their writing as well, if that's an interest that they have. What exactly are tropes? Feels like an ill-defined concept. Is a trope a cliche? Like, are they one and the same? Does it and ought it carry negative connotations? Feels like trope does. But it seems like you'll find different answers depending on who you speak to. Some people would say, well, a trope is not bad, but a cliche is. Or a cliche isn't bad, but a trope is. But I mean, a trope, as I understand it, is a recurring element. And that's about it. A recurring element. In the case of storytelling, it would be a recurring storytelling element. But I mean, how broad are we going to get here, you know? Is the 3-act structure a trope? Is it a trope that the hero wins? I mean, that happens in most stories. Is it a trope that the main characters are people instead of, like, dogs? Is it a trope that the characters have conflict? You know, some might say, well, that's ridiculous, tropes are more specific, but I'm pretty sure that there are tropes that are just incredibly broad. I mean, I guess, depending on how broadly or narrowly we define tropes, then, like, every story ever is gonna have some tropes. Because it's kind of unavoidable, isn't it? I am not familiar with the book, but I am somewhat familiar with the idea that there are, I think, it was in a book, but I can't remember what it's called, that there are 7 broad types of stories. There are 7 story types, and every story ever, you know, depending on how reductive we're being, can fit into one of those 7 story archetypes. You know, if that's the case, then when we have the conversation about tropes, you know, how easy or difficult is it to really avoid them? And I mean, I guess that's the idea, right? How should an awareness of these tropes factor into writing an analysis? Can an obsession with viewing stories through the lens of tropes paradoxically damage our media literacy, and in the case of people who want to write, damage our ability to tell a compelling story? If we know what a trope is, and we associate it with something negative, then it would seem that tropes ought to be avoided. But I mean, might that lead us to making a decision for our story or viewing another story more negatively when, in that particular story, the use of this plot element was completely appropriate, like completely and utterly appropriate. It was the correct choice for that character. You know, I don't particularly often read that TV Tropes website, which seems to have cataloged pretty much every single one of these things. But I mean, the hero's noble and heroic sacrifice, that could be said to be a trope, and you know, it could say, well, that was, you know, I saw that coming, you probably shouldn't have done that. But what if that was totally appropriate for the arc that character had gone on? Or I guess another trope would be, you know, the second act low point, that at the second act, things go badly, and then the heroes are split up, but then they eventually resolve their issues and come together. You know, it can sometimes feel like people say, yep, there's the second act low point, wow. And it feels like, well, no, so when we talk about the problem with second act low point, a more pointed and clear criticism would be, we rushed to get here. Like, we manufactured through twisting events and making our characters act not quite as they normally do. We've very much created this drama. We manufactured it in a way that's poor. And he goes, but then at that point it would be like, well, the problem wasn't the second act low point. That might have been the problem in terms of that was the objective of the writer, but the core issue was more so just sloppy writing. A lack of adherence to cause and effect, characters acting out of character. You know, it feels like any time that you're thinking about a trope, whatever the problem is, if the problem exists, it is going to be something that can be identified as a breach of cause and effect, or a breach of character, or a breach of theme, which means that if we are viewing tropes as flaws, you may potentially consider something to be a flaw when it's just not in the story. It's all supported, it all makes sense. That was the choice that was like the most valid storytelling choice. But you were just led awry because of this fixation on tropes. And I guess the idea that they ought to be avoided because it's indicative of a lack of originality. Problem is, originality in art is complicated because all creative work is derivative to some extent. What one feels compelled to write will invariably be the product of the stories they enjoy. You know, all art, it's not just storytelling, but like all art borrows from what came before. That's how you figure out what works and what doesn't work. And of course, people make changes and try new things. There is innovation in all art, including storytelling, but not like wholly 100% innovation. You know, every story is going to have characters. People tend to be a certain way in stories and in real life, and depending on which stories you like, you may pull certain traits, or you may just base a character on another character who you like, and potentially do something different with them, or do something the same with them. But, you know, it's not even really a conscious thing. Like, what you feel compelled to create is going to be influenced by what you like. And so, you know, is it any wonder why those tropes may arise? They're just things that people, you know, it may be that a trope, something in storytelling becomes a trope simply because it is effective. You know, is the 3-act structure or the hero's journey a trope because they're so often used? And, you know, if those are tropes, you know, what are you telling people? That they ought to avoid a structure that is generally pretty helpful? This is all assuming that tropes ought to be avoided. And, you know, some might say, well, no, they don't ought to be avoided. But it really feels like there is the implication of, yeah, there's that trope. Wow, oh, yeah, look at that trope. Oh, boy. You know, that there is that element to thinking about tropes and identifying them in stories. And, you know, I can't lie, there's an element of that, sometimes it happens with me when I think about, like, a Roland Emmerich film. Like, if I watch 2012, it's so mired in tropes. It's so cliche. But I feel like a lot of the things that I would point out as being flaws in that film wouldn't specifically be the tropes. They would be like the consequences of just bad writing. Like, for instance, the estranged dad becomes a hero in the eyes of his kids. That's something that happens in 2012. The problem is that there is like this complete heel turn. Like, he has a very distant relationship with his son, but then like 20 minutes later, his son is incredibly invested in the welfare of his dad. It's like a complete 180 in a span of no time at all. That's not like a trope flaw. That's just bad writing. Another one in 2012, I'll always cite it as a thing that really annoys me about that film. The stepdad Gordon, who... None of the heroes in that story would be alive if it weren't for Gordon. Gordon was the pilot who flew them out of LA, flew them all around the world, helped them get to the Arks in Nepal. And then when he's helping them sneak onto the Ark, he gets grinded to death in a bunch of gears. It's a horrible death. And then at the end of the movie, protagonist man get back together with his wife. No consideration for Gordon at all. Like, they just forgot that he existed, and that they wouldn't even be alive if it weren't for Gordon, who died horribly getting crushed to death by gears. That is an instance where you have the trope of the hero, through, you know, protagonist man, through becoming a hero, manages to mend the relationships with his family. You could say that's a trope. That's not the problem there, though. The problem is that this is not how human beings behave. You don't just forget people like that because it's inconvenient for your story to think about the moral implications of what's happening here. It feels like any time that you can identify a trope in a story and you don't like it, there is something else at play. It is not the trope itself. It is an example of the trope, but bad. But more specifically, it's just bad. That's it. How is an awareness of the tropes in this case helping you more so than simply viewing the story and trying to analyze it through the lens of cause and effect? I mean, I suppose there is a discussion to be had about the value of originality when we think about stories. You know, stories where, you know, things are really, like, expectations are consistently subverted, and you never know where it's going, but, you know, when you go back through it, it all makes sense. Those can be really exciting stories to see. And it may well be that the story is a product of an awareness of the tropes and a deliberate subversion of them. But I feel like that's indicative of a broader point that, you know, stories or tropes may present opportunities to do something really... Oh, jeez. Tropes can present themselves as opportunities to do new things by thinking about what people understand to be common recurring storytelling elements and then flipping them on their head. Thing is, though, you gotta be careful, because subversion on its own isn't really worth a whole lot. Subversion, but well executed, in line with cause and effect in the story, you go back through it and it all follows as a legitimate way that the story could have gone. that, it's... I don't feel like you're ever going to get as much value out of thinking about stories through the lens of tropes and cliches than you would if you just try to think about any stories through the lens of cause and effect, fundamentally. But nevertheless, you can think about the utility of tropes in terms of how you can use them to your advantage, or how you can take opportunities to subvert common tropes to achieve something really cool. I suppose the problem is that, in time, subversions of tropes become tropes in and of themselves. Like, subversion becomes a trope. And at that point, then, what are we doing here? What are we getting out of this thought process? A lot of great stories have some level of tropes and cliches in them, because depending on how you define tropes, it's pretty much unavoidable for any story to not have them. And here's a question, and a thought that I've just had. If we are to say that a trope is bad, that it is necessarily bad, not necessarily to the same degree, but to varying degrees, how do we judge stories which predate the tropes themselves in terms of our broad cultural awareness of them? Like, the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's got a lot of tropes in that because it's like one of the first written stories. Is the Epic of Gilgamesh bad or rendered bad because other stories which followed it just have elements that stem from that story? The Odyssey, a lot of the Greek epic poems and theater plays, Shakespeare. A lot of elements of Shakespearean stories have found their way into other stories because they were so influential. Are those stories now compromised because other stories took influence from them? That seems unfair. That a story was good, but then somehow becomes flawed. There is certainly a discussion to be had about common recurring elements in stories that typically can yield bad results, like the tacked on love interest is a pretty clear example. You often have stories where it was unnecessary or underdeveloped and really flat, and you can tell that the only reason that it was there is because there is an expectation that these stories ought to have love interests. You can definitely see how a less original and derivative and, I guess, more crowd-pleasing mindset when it comes to writing stories can just, result in elements being in a story that ought to have been removed. There is certainly a discussion to be had there. I just think that we can sometimes be overzealous in, oh, that's a trope, bad, get it out of here. Oh, that's a trope, well, that was pretty stupid. I saw that coming from a mile away. That's a trope after all. Never mind whether or not it's working in the story. Never mind if it was the best choice available to them. Never mind that it's just fine. Never mind that the alternatives that one might suggest may yield a worse story, or may just not be in line with the priorities of the writer, or the what the story is trying to be, or the amount of time that the story has, or the theme that's being aimed for. A change that you make to something that happens in a story that is a trope may well just compromise the broader theme. Maybe that trope works with the theme. How do we think about it when the trope is the point? That the story has an awareness that it's a trope and it's doing something with it on a more meta level. I think the point that I'm trying to get to, if I understand myself well enough, is that thinking about stories through the lens of tropes may well lead you astray, because I think there is something more fundamental that is going to steer you more clearly when it comes to thinking about stories, analyzing stories, and writing your own stories. And that is, does this adhere to cause and effect? Is this consistent? Is this consistent with the theme that I'm trying to explore, or the character that I'm trying to cultivate? Is this working in and of itself without much consideration for what other stories have done, or what other people are doing right now, or what the trends are? Is this the right decision for my story? Was this the right decision for their story, regardless of my awareness of tropes? And if I am crafting a story, and I can see that what I have here is a trope, I should only ever think about what changes I can make if those changes are themselves consistent with my storytelling objectives and consistent with the story as is. Not simply, well, this is a trope, I can't do this now. I think that whenever you're trying to figure out an approach for anything, but in this case specifically cultivating a skill as a writer, this is something I think about a lot because it's important to me. I want to be able to write well, and it's really difficult to figure out exactly the approach that you ought to have to consistently do well. But I think the simpler that you can get surely has to be better. If you can figure out a more simplistic but universally applicable rule set that you can follow, surely that has to yield better results than a brain that's jumbled by like 50 or 60 different tropes that are constantly on your mind and coming in and out of focus whenever you're looking at other stories, watching films, reading books, or working on your own thing. And then it just gets you tangled and you start to lose sight of what you're trying to achieve. I have to feel like a more simple approach of, hey, just make it make sense, and that's really the most important thing that you need to get done. That has to hopefully yield stronger results. Who knows, ultimately, but it really does feel like the simpler you can make your rules, the better. Thank you very much for hanging out. This was Cosmoronic number 6. I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you next time.